Poor twin sisters stopped a millionaire who was weeping over his son's death and said, "Your son is alive." When they showed him where, he fell to his knees. It was 17 minutes past 3 in the morning when John Morgan woke up to the smell of smoke. It wasn't a normal awakening. He jolted upright as if struck. His eyes opened to the dim light of the bedroom, while his mind was still trying to grasp what was wrong. The smell. The smoke. Within seconds, he was on his feet. The corridor of the mansion, normally silent at this hour, was lit by an orange glow coming from the east wing. The wing where his 1-year-old son Ben's room was located. "Ben," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. John ran through the corridors as the heat grew. The air got heavier with each step. The smoke thickened. Flames were already licking the walls, furiously devouring family portraits, silk drapes, memories. But none of that mattered. Only Ben. As he reached his son's room, a blast of heat pushed him back. The fire had already taken over the entire wing. Tall, violent flames danced, blocking any approach. John tried to push forward, but 2 security staff members held him back. "You can't go in there, Mr. Morgan. You'll die." "My son is in there," John struggled, trying to break free. "The firefighters are on their way." "Please, sir." Despair rose within him like a wild beast. Every second felt like an eternity. Outside the mansion, John watched the inferno consume everything. The firefighters arrived in 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Water jets cut through the dark night as men in heavy gear rushed in and out of the house. John stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Ben's window where the flames appeared most intense. The helplessness of doing nothing tore him apart. He was a man used to solving problems, always in control. A businessman who had built an empire from nothing. Now all his wealth, all his power meant nothing. They couldn't save his son. A housekeeper who managed to escape the fire approached him, offering a coat. Only then did John realize he was trembling, not from cold, but from fear. A deep, visceral fear he had never felt before. "It's going to be all right, sir," she said, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Dawn was breaking when the fire was finally contained. The sun rose over a scene of devastation. Half the mansion had been reduced to smoldering rubble, while the other half, damaged by water and smoke, remained standing like an empty shell. "Mr. Morgan," the fire chief approached, his face grimy with soot, wearing a grave expression. "We've searched the entire area, every room." John knew what was coming. Still, hope clung stubbornly to his heart. "What about my son?" The man lowered his gaze. "We didn't find any body in the east wing. The crib was empty." A brief flicker of hope lit John's eyes. "Empty? Then he could be—" "Mr. Morgan," the firefighter cut in gently, "the heat in that wing was extreme. In some places, the temperatures—" He hesitated. "Temperatures that wouldn't leave remains." The words fell like hammers. John felt his legs buckle. He had to lean on a fire engine to keep from collapsing. There was no body, nothing to bury, nothing to say goodbye to. Only the void, complete absence. In the hours that followed, police and investigators came and went from the property. They asked questions, took notes, snapped photos. John answered mechanically, as though detached from his own body. "Do you have any idea what could have caused the fire?" "No." "Have you noticed anything unusual in recent days?" "No." "Was there anyone else in the house besides you, your son, and the staff?" "No." The questions and answers made no difference. Nothing would make a difference now. "Mr. Morgan, we need you to identify some items." On a makeshift table in the yard lay a few objects saved from Ben's room. A charred piece of his favorite blanket. One tiny shoe, the silver rattle his grandmother had given him, now blackened by fire. John touched each item reverently, as though they were sacred relics. "They're his." The voice did not sound like his own. His personal assistant arrived around noon, alarmed by the news. He took charge of the situation, dealing with the press that was already gathering at the gates. He arranged accommodations, spoke with the insurance company, tried to spare John from all the practical and bureaucratic details that follow a tragedy. "John, let's go to a hotel. You need rest." "I'm not leaving here." "But the house isn't livable." I'm staying. Night fell again. John settled in the least damaged part of the house, a guest room on the first floor. He refused food, refused sedatives, refused the comforting words of the surviving housekeeper. Sitting on the edge of the bed, John clutched Ben's charred little shoe. In the silence of the room, memories assaulted him in painful flashes. Ben learning to sit up, his first teeth, the sound of his laughter when John tossed him in the air and caught him, his tiny hand gripping John's finger with surprising strength. Ben's birth had been a miracle. After years of trying, Emma had finally become pregnant. Our little miracle, she used to say, but Emma hadn't survived childbirth. John had become a father and a widower on the same day. Back then, the grief of losing Emma had almost destroyed him. Ben had been his salvation. During that first year, the baby became his anchor, his reason to go on. John learned to change diapers, make bottles, rock him to sleep. He cut back on office hours to be present. He hired the best staff to help, but insisted on spending as much time with his son as he could. And now, just like Emma, Ben was gone. John lay down on the bed, still dressed, holding his son's little shoe against his chest. He stared at the dark ceiling, feeling an overwhelming weight pressing down on him. It wasn't only the mansion's walls that had collapsed, it was his entire world. Outside, among the debris that had once been a home, a cold breeze blew through the ashes. A palpable emptiness lingered over everything. John knew that the next day he would have to deal with insurance, the police, the media. He would have to arrange a funeral without a body. He would have to keep existing somehow. He thought about calling Ryan, his younger brother, but had no strength even to pick up the phone. How could he explain the inexplicable? How could he put that kind of pain into words? John did not cry. Tears seemed inadequate in the face of such a colossal loss. What he felt went beyond crying, beyond any physical expression of mourning. At some point during the night, exhausted, he slid into a restless sleep. He dreamed of fire and childish laughter. He dreamed of Emma and Ben together somewhere beyond his reach. But that night, in the silence after the fire, the reality of the coming morning loomed like a shadow. John Morgan was alone, completely alone, with nothing but the agony of a goodbye that never came, and the emptiness among ruins that were once a home. The Sunday market was emptier than usual. The few vendors who braved the harsh winter displayed wilted fruits and yellowing vegetables. High prices, poor quality. Marianne pulled her worn coat tighter around her body as she watched her twin daughters dash between the stands. "Nora, Sadie, don't go too far," she called out, her voice lost in the cold wind. The 6-year-old girls were identical in appearance, same brown hair, same wide and curious eyes, but so different in temperament. Nora, older by just 7 minutes, was cautious and observant. Sadie was all movement, easy laughter, endless questions. Marianne sighed as she rummaged through her pockets. 4 coins. It wouldn't buy much. This week's sewing income had barely covered the rent for their small apartment. "All right, girls, let's head back home." "But, Mom, aren't we going to buy anything?" Sadie asked, pointing to a stand of apples. "Not today, honey. Tomorrow I'll get paid for Mrs. Peterson's dress and we'll buy something special, I promise." The twins didn't complain. They were used to going without. Ever since their father had left 3 years ago, taking all their savings with him, Marianne had raised them alone, sewing for people and taking on any honest job she could find. The walk home was long. They lived in the poorest part of the city, where the rent was just cheap enough for a single mother to manage. To save money, they always walked in even when the cold bit into their bones like today. "Look at that cloud, it looks like a dragon," Sadie pointed out, always finding magic in simple things. "It's more like a horse," Nora countered. "Serious. Then it's a dragon horse." Marianne smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. They were her strength, her light. For them, she would endure anything. "Can we take the path by the bridge?" Nora asked. "I want to see the boats." "All right, but just a quick look. It's too cold today." They left the main avenue and took a series of narrow alleys leading to a small canal. It was a shortcut they sometimes used, passing by a row of old warehouses and tiny shops. It was Nora who heard it first. They were almost at the canal when she stopped abruptly, tilting her head. "What is it?" asked Marianne. "Listen." Nora lifted a finger. In the hush of that winter Sunday, a faint, intermittent sound cut through the air. A baby's cry. "It's coming from over there." Sadie was already running toward a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. "Sadie, wait." Marianne ran after her daughter, Nora close behind. The alley was dark even at that hour of the afternoon, the high walls blocking the weak winter sunlight. It smelled of damp and garbage. Sadie was already on her knees beside a pile of dark rags when Marianne reached her. "Mom, look." Sadie's eyes were wide. Then Marianne saw it. Something stirred among the rags. Tiny hands waved in the air, and the crying, now louder, left no doubt. It was indeed a baby. Marianne knelt next to her daughter, gently pushing aside the rags. Some were singed, as if burned. And there he was, a small boy, probably no more than a year old, his face and clothes smeared with ash. "My God," Marianne whispered, her heart pounding. "Who would do such a thing?" The baby looked up at her with frightened eyes and stretched out his arms, as if begging to be held. Without hesitation, Marianne scooped him up, cradling him against her chest. "Shh, it's all right, little one. You're safe now." Nora approached cautiously, her sharp eyes inspecting the baby. "Is he hurt, Mom?" "I don't think so," Marianne replied, checking the boy's arms and legs. "Just scared and dirty." "And hungry," Sadie added, as the baby started crying more intensely. Marianne looked around the deserted alley, at the burned rags, her chest tight. Who would leave a baby so small alone in a place like this? And those burned cloths? Was there a fire involved? "What are we going to do with him, Mum?" Nora asked, her voice low and serious. For a moment, Marianne hesitated. The sensible thing would be to seek help, find whoever was responsible for the child. But something inside her resisted that idea. She knew the system too well, the institutions. She'd grown up in an orphanage after her own mother passed away, and the memories were not good. "We'll take him home," she decided at last. "He needs food and a warm bath." The girls didn't question her. Sadie was already smiling at the baby, making faces to calm him. Nora, though more reserved, helped her mother wrap the little boy in Marianne's scarf. The walk home felt longer than ever. Sadie chattered non-stop, coming up with theories about where the baby might have come from. Nora walked in silence, casting worried glances at her mother and the tiny bundle in her arms. When they finally reached their small third-floor apartment, Marianne laid the baby on the kitchen table and began removing his filthy clothes. Under the bright light, she could see he was healthy, with no marks or injuries, just very dirty and frightened. Nora filled the basin with warm water. "Sadie, grab one of your old nightgowns from the closet." The girls ran to help, excited by their new responsibility. Marianne carefully cleaned the baby, wiping soot from his face and light-colored hair. He was no longer crying, just watching everything with curious eyes. "He must be hungry," Sadie observed. "We can give him our milk." "We only have half a pint left," Nora reminded her. "It was supposed to last until tomorrow." "It's okay," Marianne decided. "He needs it more than we do." While the baby drank eagerly from a cup Marianne improvised, she wondered what to do next. Life was already difficult enough with two daughters to raise alone. How could she manage another child, especially one so young, requiring constant care? Night fell outside, and with it came a sharp drop in temperature. Wind howled through the gaps in the poorly sealed window. The baby, now clean and fed, began yawning in Marianne's arms. "Where will he sleep, Mom?" Sadie asked. "We can make a little bed for him with our blankets," Nora suggested. "Why can't he stay with us?" Sadie asked hopefully. "He has no one else." Marianne watched as her daughters prepared a cozy corner with pillows and blankets. She thought about the struggles they already faced. Rent always overdue, meals growing scarcer, clothes patched so many times you could barely see the original fabric. "What if," Nora began hesitantly, "what if he stays until we figure out where he came from?" The baby had fallen asleep in Marianne's arms, now breathing evenly. His face, free of soot, showed rosy cheeks and long lashes. So small, so vulnerable. Marianne thought of her own childhood in the orphanage, the loneliness, the lack of affection, the constant sense of not belonging. She wouldn't wish that on any child. "He'll stay with us," she said at last. "At least for now." The twins smiled, already turning back to finalize the baby's little sleeping area. Marianne watched them, feeling a mixture of fear and resolve. She didn't know where this baby came from or what the future held. She only knew she couldn't abandon him. Sometimes the most important decisions are made not with the head, but with the heart. And Marianne's heart told her this little stranger needed her. Even though she had so little to give, she chose to care. Even without answers, she chose to love. And for now, that would have to be enough. The first few days were tough. The baby woke up crying several times a night, frightened, as though he could still feel the heat of flames. Marianne barely slept, juggling her sewing jobs and the little one's needs. "What are we going to call him?" Sadie asked on the morning of the third day, watching the baby play with a wooden spoon in the kitchen. Marianne paused her stirring of the thin porridge she was making for breakfast. It was a good question. Until then, they had only referred to him as the baby or little one. "Ben," Nora said suddenly from the doorway. "He looks like a Ben." "Ben," Marianne repeated, looking at the baby. He turned his head at the sound, as if he recognized it. "Do you like that name, little one? Ben?" The baby smiled, revealing 4 small white teeth. It was the first smile since they had found him. "He likes it," Sadie exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Ben, Ben, Ben." And so, without ceremony, the baby got a name. Ben, short, simple, easy to say. A name that seemed to fit him perfectly. Over the following days, Ben adapted to his new routine. His nighttime crying lessened, and soon he was sleeping through the night, curled up in a nest of blankets the girls laid out for him every evening beside their bed. "He's getting chubbier," Marianne remarked one afternoon, changing the boy's improvised clothes. It was true. Ben's cheeks had filled out, and his gaze no longer held the emptiness of those early days. His bright blue eyes now shone with curiosity. Feeding him wasn't easy. Meals were already sparse for 3, and now they had to stretch to feed 4. Marianne took on more sewing work, toiling late into the night after the children were asleep. Sometimes exhaustion overcame her, and she'd fall asleep over her fabrics, needle still in hand. Yet Ben's presence brought something new to the little family, a different joy, a renewed purpose. "Look, Mum, he knows how to clap just like I taught him." Sadie proudly showed how Ben mimicked her clapping, laughing happily. Nora, quieter, spent hours reading her school books aloud to the baby, who listened intently, as though he understood every word. "He's very smart," she would say seriously. "He learns fast." In just a few weeks, it felt as though Ben had always been there. He fit into the family's routine like a missing puzzle piece. He woke up early with Marianne, ate his porridge while she got the girls ready for school, then stayed in her lap while she worked on simpler sewing tasks. "Here, hold the measuring tape for me," she would say, and Ben would grab the tape with his chubby little hands, delighted to help. In the afternoon, when the girls returned from school, it was a celebration. Ben recognized them from afar and would wiggle with excitement. "Our little brother's waiting!" Sadie would exclaim, racing inside. "We brought something for you, Ben," Nora would add, usually some small treasure, a pretty leaf, a shiny pebble, a drawing. Both girls had fully adopted Ben as their own. To them, there was no doubt he was part of the family now. Neighbors asked questions, of course. Where had that baby come from? Marianne would evade, claiming he was her cousin's child who needed temporary care. Most people didn't pry further. In that neighborhood, folks had learned to respect each other's secrets. "You'll need papers for him someday," Mrs. Tanner, an elderly neighbor who occasionally babysat Ben, remarked. "If you want to enroll him in school or if he ever gets sick." Marianne knew she was right, but she preferred not to think about it just yet. One problem at a time. For the moment, Ben was safe and healthy. That was what mattered. And most surprisingly, Marianne was happy too. Despite the extra work, the sleepless nights, and the constant worry about money, she found herself smiling more often. A certain lightness filled her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. One night, after a particularly tough day, barely any sewing jobs, nearly empty pantry, bills to pay, Marianne looked at the dinner table where everyone sat. The meal was simple: thin vegetable soup and a loaf of bread cut into 4 portions, barely enough to fill them. Yet no one complained. Sadie was recounting a wild story about a squirrel she had seen on the way to school. Nora was correcting her details with characteristic seriousness. It wasn't green, Sadie, it was brown with a funny mark. And Ben, on Marianne's lap, banged a spoon on the table, laughing at Sadie's silly faces. The apartment was small and cold. The furniture was old and patched. The dinner was too simple, but there was so much love in that moment, so much warmth, so much life. Ben turned his face up to Marianne's, those blue eyes now fully recognizing her. "Ma," he babbled for the first time. It wasn't quite a word, more a sound, but the meaning was there. A wave of warmth filled Marianne's chest. It was as though their little circle of light had expanded just enough to include this new member, brought to them by fate. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing the top of Ben's head. "Mama's here." The soup grew cold in their bowls, the wind whistled through the cracks in the window, and the world outside remained harsh and unforgiving. But at that simple table, a small miracle was taking place, a miracle of comfort and healing. Ben, who had arrived at their door frightened and fragile, was flourishing under the warmth of their simple love, and without realizing it, while they cared for him, they too were healing. Sadie burst into giggles at something Nora said, and soon they were all laughing. Ben, not even understanding the joke, laughed as well, simply happy to be there in that moment, with the people who, in such a short time, had become his entire world. Marianne watched the scene, engraving it in her memory. In the simplicity of that moment lay everything that mattered. They didn't have much, but they had enough. They had no answers for the future, but they had the present, and for now that was all. Nearly a month had passed since Ben came into their lives. Winter was beginning to lose its grip. Some mornings brought a timid sun peeking through the clouds, not enough to truly warm them, but promising better days. The little family had found a new rhythm. Marianne would sew while Ben played on the floor nearby, often dozing off among colorful spools and soft scraps she laid out for him. Ben was no longer the scared baby they had found in that alley. His cheeks were now pink and full, his bright blue eyes were alive with curiosity, and his small body grew stronger every day. He could stand for a few seconds, holding onto the furniture, and he crawled at surprising speed around the apartment. "He'll be walking before he's 18 months, I bet," Nora remarked one evening, watching Ben venture from the table to the couch. "That's because he has 2 teachers," Marianne replied, smiling at her daughters. "You two are very patient with him." It was true. The twins adored their new role as big sisters. Sadie invented games and songs that made Ben erupt in giggles, while Nora, more methodical, created little exercises to encourage his development, inspired by what she learned at school. That Thursday morning began like many others. Marianne woke before dawn to finish a dress she had to deliver that afternoon. It was an important job for the wife of one of the managers at Morgan Industries, and it would pay enough to keep them somewhat comfortable for the next 2 weeks. The sun was already up when she sewed the final stitch. She admired her work for a moment, then carefully folded it and placed it in a box lined with blue tissue paper. "Done," she announced, stretching her arms to ease the tension. She glanced at the clock on the wall. "Girls, you can still make it to school if you hurry." Sadie and Nora, who had been playing with Ben in the tiny living room, rushed off to get ready. Within 15 minutes, they were prepared, wearing their worn but clean backpacks. Breakfast was the same thin oatmeal as always. The pantry was nearly empty, with just a handful of flour and some wilted vegetables. Marianne served generous portions to the girls and Ben, leaving only a few spoonfuls for herself. "I'll get paid for the dress today," she said, noticing Nora's worried look. Nora always realized when Marianne sacrificed her portion. "Then we'll go shopping. We'll have a special dinner tonight." The girls' eyes lit up at the promise. Special dinners were rare, usually reserved for birthdays or Christmas. "Can we have fresh bread?" Sadie asked hopefully. Marianne mentally counted her money. The payment for the dress would be decent, but there was overdue rent, the electric bill, medicine for Ben's cough the previous week. "We'll see," she replied, not wanting to promise what she might not afford. "Can we buy it after school?" Sadie insisted. "Mrs. Klein's bakery is on the way." "Please." There was such pure enthusiasm in Sadie's face that Marianne couldn't refuse. "All right," she relented, taking a few coins from her little savings box. "Here, get a small loaf on your way home. But come straight back afterward, understand? I have to deliver the dress by 4. "Yes, Mom," they replied in unison, carefully pocketing the coins. Marianne helped them bundle up, though the sun was out, the air was still cold, and walked them to the door. "Straight to school and back, with a quick stop at the bakery," she repeated, adjusting Nora's scarf, which always came loose. "I promise I'll watch out for her," Nora said, serious as a miniature adult. "Hey," Sadie protested, but smiled anyway. Marianne watched her daughters descend the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the old building. When she went back inside, Ben was waiting on the worn rug, playing with a small wooden car a neighbor had given him. "Just you and me now, little one," she said, scooping him up. "Shall we finish preparing this dress for delivery?" The day went by smoothly. Marianne wrapped the dress in tissue, placed it in the box, and tied it with a satin ribbon she'd been saving for a special occasion. Ben took his morning and afternoon naps, waking in a cheerful mood, ready for more mini-adventures around the apartment. At 2 in the afternoon, Marianne left Ben with Mrs. Tanner, the elderly neighbor from downstairs who often helped her. Then she set out to deliver the dress. The client's house was on the other side of the city, in an upscale district. Marianne took 2 buses to get there, clutching the box like a treasure. The contrast between neighborhoods always struck her. How could such different realities exist within the same city? The client was delighted with the dress, trying it on immediately and admiring the perfect fit. "You have a gift, Marianne," she praised, twirling in front of the mirror. "I'll recommend you to my friends." In addition to the agreed payment, the woman gave Marianne a generous tip. Feeling lighter than she had in weeks, Marianne bought groceries on her way home: meat, potatoes, carrots, onions for a stew. She also purchased flour, eggs, a bit of butter, items she hadn't brought into her kitchen for a long while. It was almost 4:30 when she arrived home. She thanked Mrs. Tanner, who again refused any payment, insisting that Ben's company was enough of a reward. "He's an angel," the woman said, patting the baby's head one last time. "So different from most children. There's something special about him." Marianne silently agreed. Ben was indeed special, and she silently thanked fate for bringing him to her. She started preparing the stew, chopping vegetables while Ben played by her side. Occasionally she glanced at the clock. The girls should have been home by now. 5 o'clock. No sign of them. 5:15. The stew simmered on the stove, filling the kitchen with a delicious aroma. 5:30. Marianne began to genuinely worry. Sadie and Nora never came home this late. She looked out the window, noticing it was starting to rain. Then she heard hurried footsteps on the stairs. The door opened, and the twins entered, soaked from the rain, their expressions unlike anything Marianne had ever seen. Shock and confusion mixed together. "What happened?" she asked, alarmed. "Are you all right? Where's the bread?" The girls exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Something was very wrong. "Mom," Nora began, her voice deeper than usual. "We need to talk." Marianne felt her stomach clench. She only heard that phrase when something serious happened. "What is it?" She tried to keep her voice calm, though her heart pounded. "We went to Mrs. Klein's bakery, like you said," Sadie explained, words tumbling out. "There were lots of people there. Everyone was watching the TV in the window." "Mrs. Klein got a new television," Nora added. "They were showing the news." "What about?" Marianne asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "The fire at the Morgan mansion," Nora said, now looking at Ben, who had crawled over to Marianne and clung to her skirt. "Remember we talked about it at school? It happened almost a month ago." Of course, Marianne remembered. The fire at the city's wealthiest family's mansion had been the talk of everyone for days. But what did that have to do with them? "The news was about Mr. Morgan's son," Sadie whispered, her voice trembling. "The baby who went missing in the fire." A chill swept through Marianne. Unconsciously, she scooped Ben into her arms, as though protecting him. "They showed a photo," Nora said, now looking directly at Marianne. "Mom, it was Ben. Our Ben." The world seemed to freeze. Marianne stared at the baby in her arms, his fair hair, his intense blue eyes, the delicate features that, now that she thought about it, had always seemed somewhat familiar. "You must be mistaken," she said, shaking her head. "It's probably another baby. There are plenty of babies with blonde hair and—" "Mom," Nora interrupted, her gaze steady. "It was him. They said the name Benjamin Morgan, Ben. The same age as our Ben. He disappeared the night of the fire, the same night, before we found him in that alley. And that alley is less than a mile from the mansion," Sadie added. "And the burned rags," Nora went on. "The ash on his face when we found him." Marianne felt as if the floor was falling away beneath her. Everything fit together in a terrible way. The singed cloth, the baby's initial shock, the spot where they'd discovered him. "There's more," Nora said, pulling a folded newspaper from her jacket pocket. "We got this at the stand next to the bakery." With trembling fingers, Marianne took the newspaper. It was from 3 weeks ago. The headline read, "Tragedy strikes the Morgan family," and there was the photo, a mansion ablaze, and in a smaller inset, a man in a suit holding a smiling baby, John Morgan and his son Benjamin. The baby in the photo was undeniably the same child who now nestled in her arms. "He's still searching," Sadie said, her voice catching. "Mr. Morgan. On TV, he said he refuses to believe his son is dead. He's offering a reward." Marianne felt like she'd been punched. Reward. That was how people would see it, if she returned Ben, that she wanted money. "It's not about money, Mom," Nora said, as if reading her mind. "It's just, it doesn't seem right. Mr. Morgan on TV. He looked so sad." Marianne couldn't speak. Her world was falling apart. The joy she'd felt only hours earlier, the extra money, the special dinner, all of it, now seemed meaningless. "Let's have dinner," she said finally, her voice distant, like someone else's. Then we'll decide what to do." The meal took place in a heavy silence. The stew, which should have been a reason to celebrate, was barely touched. Ben ate happily, unaware of the drama unfolding around him, occasionally offering pieces of potato to Marianne or the twins, giggling when they accepted. After dinner, the girls washed the dishes without being asked. Marianne remained at the table, Ben in her arms, gazing out the window without really seeing anything. "What are we going to do, Mum?" Sadie asked, breaking the silence once the last pan was dried and put away. Marianne looked at her daughters. Sadie's eyes brimmed with tears. Nora wore that grave expression that seemed so out of place on a 6-year-old. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I need to think." The girls accepted her reply and got ready for bed. Marianne bathed Ben, dressed him in a nightgown she had sewn herself, and tucked him into the makeshift bed beside the twins. "Story," Sadie requested, as she did every night. Marianne nodded, taking the old storybook she'd had since childhood. She read about princes and princesses, dragons and castles, while Ben slowly drifted off, and the twins struggled to stay awake for the ending. When all 3 children were finally asleep, Marianne returned to the living room. She picked up the newspaper again, studying John Morgan's photo. He was a handsome man with the same shade of blonde hair and the same blue eyes as Ben. His face showed signs of exhaustion and grief, even in a photo taken before the tragedy. The article detailed the fire and how John Morgan had tried to save his son but was thwarted by the flames. It explained how the baby's body was never found, leading authorities to conclude that it had been completely consumed by the fire. But John Morgan didn't believe that. According to the article, he insisted his son was alive, that someone must have taken him during or before the fire. The police considered it unlikely, merely the desperate hope of a grieving father. Marianne folded the newspaper and placed it in the kitchen drawer. Her mind whirled. On one hand, there was her immense love for Ben. The little one had become part of her family, her son in every way that mattered. Losing him would be like losing a piece of herself. On the other hand, there was John Morgan, a man who loved this child as much as she did. A man who, unlike her, had a legal right to Ben. A man suffering the worst nightmare a father could imagine, believing his son was alive somewhere but unable to find him. There was also the practical reality. What kind of life could she offer Ben? A life of want, without access to the best schools or doctors. A life always lived in the shadows, fearing discovery. Late into the night, after the city had gone quiet except for the distant hum of a car or two, Marianne returned to the children's room. Ben lay sound asleep, one tiny fist clutching the rag doll she had made for him. She sat beside his little bed, watching him, every breath, every small movement during sleep. She memorized every detail, as though she knew she'd soon have only memories. Her decision was made, though it broke her heart to acknowledge it. Tomorrow, she and the twins would go to the Morgan mansion. They would return Ben to his father. Marianne gently lifted Ben so as not to wake him. He snuggled against her chest, sighing contentedly in his sleep. At last, the tears she had been holding back all day found release, silently rolling down her cheeks as she rocked him. "I love you so much, little one," she whispered, barely audible. "You brought so much light into our lives." And she stayed there, cradling him, quietly weeping. She wept for a baby she was losing before she had truly lost him. She wept for her daughters, who would feel the absence of the brother they had learned to love. She wept for herself, for the loneliness that would return. Oddly, she also wept for John Morgan, a man she had never met, but with whom she now shared a love for this small, precious child. A man who would soon experience the joy she was losing. The night wore on, each minute precious and painful. Outside, the stars shone faintly behind clouds, and the city continued in its indifferent rhythm. From the children's window, Marianne could see the distant outlines of the grand houses on the hill. Somewhere up there, a man was likely awake as well, staring at the same night sky, carrying the same sorrow, unaware that his world was about to change forever. And hers would, too. Morning arrived cold and grey, as if the sky reflected Marianne's mood. She hadn't slept. She had kept vigil, watching over Ben, etching every feature into her memory. "Mom?" Nora stood at the bedroom door, already dressed despite the early hour. It was only 6 in the morning. "Have you decided?" Marianne nodded silently, not trusting her voice. "We're going today," Nora pressed. "Yes," Marianne finally managed, her throat dry and scratchy. "As soon as Ben wakes up and has breakfast." Nora came closer and sat beside her mother, looking at the peacefully sleeping baby. "It'll be hard," the girl said with a wisdom beyond her years. "But it's the right thing to do." Marianne pulled her daughter into a hug, unable to hold back tears. They stayed like that for a moment, silent, sharing their pain. Sadie joined them soon after, her hair a mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Unlike her sister, she didn't try to hide her sorrow. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she sat at Ben's feet. "Can't we keep him?" she asked in a hushed tone, though she already knew the answer. "No, sweetheart," Marianne replied, extending her arm to include Sadie in the hug. "He has a family, a father who loves him and misses him." "We're his family too," Sadie insisted, a sob escaping her throat. "Yes, we are," Marianne agreed. "We always will be. But he belongs with his father." The three of them stayed there, watching Ben sleep. Eventually he stirred, stretching as he did each morning. His eyes opened, and he saw them looking at him. He gave them a radiant smile that shattered Marianne's heart into pieces. "Mama!" he cried, reaching out to her. Marianne scooped him into her arms, holding him as though she would never let go. "Good morning, my love," she whispered against his hair. "Did you sleep well?" Ben babbled happily, little hands grabbing Marianne's face as he always did. Breakfast was silent. Ben, unaware of the heavy mood, ate his oatmeal with gusto. Occasionally, he'd try to feed Sadie with his spoon, an act that would usually draw giggles. Today, it only deepened the ache of what was coming. "How are we going to get to the mansion?" Nora asked, finally breaking the hush. "It's on the other side of town." Marianne hadn't considered that. The Morgan home was in a wealthy district, far from theirs. They would need at least 2 buses. "We'll take the bus," she decided. "We have a little money left from yesterday." "What if he's not there?" Sadie questioned. "Then we'll come back tomorrow," Marianne replied. "Or the next day." Until we find him. When breakfast was done, Marianne dressed Ben in his best clothes. In truth, the only ones that weren't handmade from scraps, a small pair of pants and a light shirt she had bought the previous week, using part of the rent money. "You look like a prince," she said, smoothing his golden hair. Ben smiled, oblivious to the significance of that day. An hour later, they were ready to leave. Marianne had packed a small bag with Ben's cloth rabbit and a few of his things. Not much. She didn't want it to seem like she expected anything in return. The bus ride was long and quiet. Sadie stared out the window the entire time, while Nora held Ben's hand as he sat on Marianne's lap. As they neared the Morgans' neighborhood, the scenery changed. The houses grew larger, streets wider, and trees more abundant. It felt like another world, far from their cramped reality. They got off the second bus a few blocks from the mansion. They would have to walk the rest of the way. The fire had been big news, and anyone in the city could point them toward the Morgan property. When they finally saw the gates, Marianne's legs almost gave out. A large portion of the mansion was in ruins, but the front still stood, bearing evident marks of smoke and water damage. Construction workers were rebuilding parts of it. "Now what?" Nora asked. "Do we just go in?" Marianne hesitated. She hadn't thought this far. How would she explain herself? How would she say they had the missing baby everyone believed was dead? What if they were accused of something? "I don't know, honey. Maybe we should—" But her words were cut short by Sadie's shout. "Look! It's him!" Following Sadie's gaze, Marianne saw a man standing near the rubble of the east wing. Even from a distance, she recognized him from the newspaper photo. John Morgan. He had his back to them, shoulders slumped, the posture of someone carrying an invisible weight. He wore simple dark clothes, not the crisp suit from the photograph. In his hand, he held something small that Marianne couldn't identify. "Mom." Nora looked at her, waiting for guidance. Panic flared within Marianne. Was she truly ready for this? To give up Ben? To say goodbye? But before she could decide, Sadie acted. With the impulsiveness typical of a 6-year-old, she let go of Marianne's hand and ran toward John Morgan. "Sadie," Marianne called, but her daughter was already halfway there. Nora glanced at her mother for a moment, then followed her sister. Marianne stood rooted, Ben in her arms, watching her daughters run toward the man who would change all their lives forever. John Morgan did not hear the girls approach. He was lost in his thoughts, as he so often was since the tragedy. He held in his hand a small charred shoe, Ben's, the only tangible reminder he had. His nights were filled with nightmares of fire and smoke. His days with a futile search. Despite all evidence, and against everyone's opinions, he refused to believe his son was dead. He had offered a reward, hired private investigators, questioned all the staff, searched the ruins countless times. Nothing, no leads, no concrete hope. Only this inexplicable feeling, this unfounded certainty that Ben was alive somewhere. "Mister?" The small voice pulled him out of his thoughts. John turned, surprised. 2 identical girls stood before him, one slightly ahead, the other a step behind. Twins, he noted, wearing simple school uniforms. They had expressions far too serious for children so young. "Yes," he asked, wondering what 2 children were doing here alone. The girl in front took another step, her big eyes fixed on him. "Your son's alive." The words hit John like a physical blow. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, that his desperation was conjuring voices. "What?" he managed, his voice weak. "Your son," the girl repeated, with the candid simplicity of a child. "Ben, he's alive. We found him." John felt the world spin. His legs wobbled, and he had to lean against a broken wall for support. His heart pounded so violently it felt about to burst. "Who are you?" he asked, words coming in ragged gasps. "Is this some kind of cruel joke?" The second girl stepped forward, her expression more serious than her sister's. "It's not a joke," she said with surprising maturity. "We found your son almost a month ago. In an alley near the canal, he was alone, in burned clothes." John looked from one girl to the other, desperately wanting to believe, but terrified of being deceived. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to exploit his pain. But these were just children. Where is he now?" he asked, barely forming the words. The more solemn girl pointed behind them. John followed her gesture and saw a short distance away a woman standing with a blonde baby in her arms. Time stopped. Even from afar, John would recognize that little face anywhere. The same golden hair, the same blue eyes, the same shape he had memorized in every detail during his son's first year of life. Ben. The charred shoe slipped from John's hand, forgotten. The hope he had clung to for weeks, a faint spark kept alive by sheer stubbornness, exploded in his chest like wildfire. All the pain and despair of the last month gave way to an emotion so intense he could barely breathe. "Ben," he whispered, and began walking toward the woman, each step quicker than the last. The girls followed. Marianne saw John Morgan approach and felt fear surge inside her. What would he think of her? That she had kidnapped his son? That she wanted money? She felt exposed, vulnerable, unsure what to say or how to explain. But when John drew close enough to see Ben's face clearly, all those worries vanished. The expression on this man's face, a mixture of disbelief, joy, and pure anguish, told her everything. "Benjamin," he called, voice trembling. Hearing his full name, Ben turned his head, curious. His eyes met John's, eyes so much like his own. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Ben smiled, a big smile Marianne knew so well, revealing a few small white teeth. And to Marianne's surprise, he reached his arms out to John. "Papa!" he exclaimed, with the same clarity he used for "Ma." That was more than John could bear. His legs gave way, and he sank to his knees, openly sobbing, no longer trying to hide his tears. Marianne moved closer, tears streaming down her own cheeks. Carefully, she knelt to his level, still holding Ben. "Your son," she said in a near whisper. "We found him almost a month ago, in an alley not far from here, wrapped in burned cloth." John looked up, his red-rimmed eyes locked on hers. You took care of him all this time." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Thank you," he said, the word laden with immeasurable gratitude. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Gently, as if afraid this was all a dream, John reached for Ben. Marianne felt the child shift away from her, moving toward his father. This was it, the final moment she had dreaded. But seeing Ben's joy and the profound emotion on John's face, and she knew it was right. Ben belonged here, with his father. John held his son tightly, burying his face in those golden curls, as though confirming Ben was real, truly in his arms. Ben, thrilled with the attention, clapped and laughed. "You came back to me," John murmured against his son's forehead, kissing it gently. "You came back." Sadie and Nora were by Marianne's side now, each holding one of her hands, watching the scene with mingled joy and sadness. John finally rose to his feet, clutching Ben as if he'd never let him go. "I don't know how to thank you," he said to Marianne, his voice steadier now. You brought my son back. I thought I had lost everything." "There's no need to thank us," Marianne replied, feeling a strange peace amidst the sorrow of saying goodbye. "He's a special boy. He brought us a lot of joy these past weeks." John looked at the girls, who were studying him curiously. "What are your names?" he asked kindly. "I'm Sadie," the more talkative one answered. "And this is Nora. We're twins, and this is our mum, Marianne." John smiled at them, a smile that had not graced his face for many long weeks. "Thank you, Sadie and Nora," he said, "for finding my Ben, for caring for him, for bringing me here today." Nora, usually so contained, stepped forward to John and Ben. With a seriousness that belied her age, she said, "Take good care of him. He likes bedtime stories, and he's afraid of the dark." John nodded, equally solemn. "I'll remember," he promised, "and you can visit any time you want. You'll always be welcome." Marianne knew it was only kindness, that they might never see Ben again after today, but she appreciated the gesture all the same. "We should go," she mustered, calling up all her strength. "The bus—" "No," John interrupted. "Please, you must be hungry, and I have so many questions. I'd like you to come inside. My driver can take you home later." Marianne hesitated. She didn't want to prolong the farewell, Yet she did want to know more about the man to whom she was entrusting the baby she loved like a son. "All right," she finally agreed. As they walked toward the intact portion of the mansion, Ben still in his father's arms, Marianne glanced at the sky. The grey clouds were starting to part, revealing a timid ray of sunlight in the distance. It felt appropriate, she thought, a new beginning, for Ben returning to his real home, for John regaining his reason to live, and for her and the girls, and who, despite the pain of loss, would forever carry the love of a little angel who'd stepped into their lives briefly, yet left an indelible mark. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a final goodbye, but the start of an unexpected new story. Marianne awoke to the familiar sound of rain on the window. For an instant, that brief moment between dream and reality, she expected to hear Ben's cheerful babbling, but then memories of the previous day flooded in, and with them, emptiness. Ben had gone home, his real home. She was glad for him, of course. The image of John Morgan embracing his son, the pure joy on his face, the way Ben had recognized him immediately, all of it affirmed they had done the right thing. But it didn't lessen the pain. The afternoon at the Morgan mansion had felt surreal. John insisted they stay for lunch, and Marianne hadn't the heart to refuse, especially seeing her daughter's excitement. The housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Peterson, prepared a meal that seemed like a feast to them. During lunch, John had hardly let Ben out of his arms. He kept asking about his son's preferences, habits, and likes. Marianne answered patiently, while Sadie and Nora chimed in with excited tales about their little brother. Afterwards, John's driver took them home, just as promised. The farewell was easier than Marianne expected, perhaps because Ben seemed so happy, so obviously at home, reducing some of her guilt for missing him. Now on the morning after, it was time to return to normal life, or try to... "Mom." Nora appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school. "It's time." Sadie was right behind, sleepy-eyed, her face still puffy from the tears she'd cried the night before. "I don't want to go to school today," she mumbled. Marianne was about to say they needed to go, that life goes on, when she heard a knock at the door. Who could it be this early? "Stay here," she told the girls, going to answer it. When she opened the door, she could hardly believe her eyes. John Morgan stood there, dressed more casually than the day before, and by his side, wrapped in a blue coat, was Ben, grinning the moment he saw Marianne. "Good morning," John greeted, a slight hint of awkwardness in his voice. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, of course not," Marianne replied, too stunned to say much else. "Please, come in." The modest apartment looked even more humble with John standing there. Worn furniture, peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, but if he noticed, he gave no sign. "Ben wanted to say hello," he explained as the baby squirmed in his arms, clearly wanting to go to Marianne. "He woke up early asking for Mama." Marianne's heart squeezed. With a brief glance at John, who nodded, she took Ben from his arms. The boy clung to her neck just like every morning before. "Mama," he crowed happily. "Hello, my love," she whispered, tears she couldn't hold back filling her eyes. "It's so good to see you." Just then came a burst of excitement from the hallway. Sadie and Nora dashed into the living room, their faces lighting up when they saw Ben. "Ben!" they shouted in unison, running to hug their little brother, still in Marianne's arms. John watched the scene with an unreadable expression. Sadness, perhaps, but something else too. Resolution, maybe. "Actually," he said when the initial excitement died down, "we didn't just come for a visit. There's something important I need to discuss with you, Marianne." The girls understood the signal and led Ben into their room, eager to show him the wonders of their tiny domain. Marianne directed John to the small kitchen table, offering him the only chair that didn't squeak. "Coffee?" she offered automatically. "No, thank you," he replied politely. Then, without further ado, he got straight to the point. "I spent last night thinking about everything that happened, how fate worked to bring Ben back to me." Marianne nodded, uncertain where he was going with this. "If you and your daughters hadn't found him in that alley, if you hadn't cared for him with such love," John paused, visibly moved, "my son would be dead." Marianne. You and your girls saved his life. And mine too. We only did what anyone would do, she murmured, glancing away. No, it wasn't what just anyone would do. You took him in when you had no obligation. You cared for him when you could barely provide for yourselves. And then yesterday, you did something even more extraordinary. You brought him back to me, when you could have just kept him. Marianne wanted to say that it wouldn't have been right to keep Ben, that he deserved to be with his father, but her words stuck in her throat. I want to repay you, John continued. Not because I feel indebted, but because I want to. He reached into his jacket's inner pocket and placed an envelope on the table. Marianne eyed it nervously. I don't want money, she said firmly. John smiled kindly, a warmth softening the exhaustion on his face. It's not money, well, not directly. He slid the envelope toward her. Please, open it. With trembling fingers, Marianne complied. Inside was a key and an official document. She skimmed it, not fully understanding what it meant. It's the deed to a house, John explained. A small but comfortable house in a better part of town. It's not too far from here, but it's a much safer neighborhood with better schools for the girls. Marianne felt her cheeks burn with a mix of embarrassment and wounded pride. I can't accept this, she said, sliding the envelope back. It's not charity, Marianne, John insisted, his voice firm yet gentle. It's the least I can do for the people who saved my son. He leaned across the table, his eyes locked on hers. I understand your pride. I respect it. But think of your daughters, the opportunities they'd have, better schools, a safer place to grow up. Marianne glanced toward the bedroom, where the girls' laughter mingled with Ben's squeals. It was true. Their current school was lacking, their neighborhood too dangerous for two little girls. Moreover, John continued, as though reading her thoughts, Ben would miss them. And you. I don't want my son to be separated from people he clearly loves, and who love him. That was the part Marianne hadn't dared voice, not even to herself. The thought of never seeing Ben again weighed on her like a constant heaviness. The house has 3 bedrooms, John explained. There's a space on the ground floor that could be turned into a sewing studio if you'd like. It's only 10 minutes from Westridge School, where your girls could enroll. I've already paid their tuition for next year. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to hire you as the exclusive seamstress for my company. It was too much to process at once. A house of their own, quality schooling for the twins, a workspace for her, a chance to keep seeing Ben. Why are you doing this? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. John looked toward the bedroom door, where the children's happy chatter continued. Because last night, when I came home with Ben, I realized he wouldn't stop asking for Mama and for the girls. He gained a family this past month, Marianne, a family that loved him when I wasn't there. And, he paused, choosing his words, because I know what it is to lose someone you love. I lost my wife when Ben was born, and I thought I lost my son in the fire. I don't want you or your girls to lose him completely, and I don't want him to lose you. Tears welled up in Marianne's eyes again. There was such sincerity in his words, such a profound understanding of her pain. Besides, John added with a slight smile, my son needs a mother figure in his life, and he's already chosen you. That simple statement undid Marianne's last defenses. It wasn't charity. It was a bridge between two families bound by a shared love for one small child. All right, she said finally, we accept, but on one condition. I want to pay rent on the house. A fair amount that I can afford, John started to argue, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he nodded. If that's what you want, we can set a symbolic amount. He held out his hand, and she shook it, sealing the agreement. It was strange how suddenly the future, which had looked so dark only hours before, now opened up to new possibilities. When can we move in? She asked, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. Today, if you like, the house is ready. I had it prepared last night. The speed of it all was astonishing. John had thought of everything. A small truck arrived at the apartment 2 hours later to transport Marianne's few belongings. Mrs. Peterson, the Morgan Mansion's housekeeper, appeared with 2 other women to help pack. The twins could barely contain their excitement. The prospect of a new home, with a room of their own, a different school, felt like a grand adventure. And the possibility of seeing Ben regularly changed their heartbreak into anticipation. John and Ben stayed until everything was packed. Feeling the energy around him, the baby applauded each time a box was sealed. "We'll meet you at the new house soon," John said when the last item was loaded. "My driver will take you there." The house exceeded all their expectations. It was on a quiet, tree-lined street, surrounded by similarly well-kept homes. It wasn't large or lavish like the Morgan mansion, but compared to their cramped apartment, it felt like a palace. A small garden graced the front yard, with a swing hanging from a single tree. The facade was a soft yellow, with white windows and a grey roof. 3 steps led to a front door painted bright blue. Inside, everything was spotless and pleasantly furnished. Not ostentatious, but cozy and comfortable. In what would be Marianne's sewing studio, a brand new machine gleamed on a sturdy work table, surrounded by shelves and drawers for supplies. "It's perfect," Sadie whispered, running from room to room, Nora following, quieter but equally awed. "I hope you like it," John said, watching their reactions. "If you want to change anything, redecorate." "It's more than we could have ever dreamed," Marianne managed, too emotional to say more. Ben, in his father's arms, reached out for her. John handed him over without hesitation. "Mama!" the baby exclaimed, content to be in her arms again. "Can he stay for dinner?" Sadie asked, tugging on John's sleeve. "Please," he smiled, a smile that lit his tired face. "Sure, if your mom doesn't mind having 2 extra guests." Marianne nodded, speechless. This new reality still felt like a dream. Dinner was simple, but joyful. Marianne used some of the groceries she'd brought, and others already stocked in the pantry. Another thoughtful gesture from John, she chose not to comment on for pride's sake. Ben was passed around to everyone's lap, soaking up the attention. The twins chatted excitedly about plans for their new school, the garden and the room they would share. As night fell and Ben started showing signs of fatigue, John stood to leave. "Can he visit again tomorrow?" Nora asked, always direct. "Anytime you want," John replied. "This house is as much his as the mansion, and you're always welcome to visit him as well." At the door, with a sleepy Ben in his arms, John paused. "Thank you, Marianne." "For everything." She simply nodded, no words needed. There was a silent understanding, a bond that defied explanation. Once the door closed, Marianne looked around her new home. The twins were already exploring every corner, discussing where they'd place their toys and which colors to paint their room. It was a fresh start. Not just a roof over their heads, not just better food or clothes, but the possibility of a different future, one where her daughters would have opportunities she never imagined she could give them. And for Marianne, it was also a chance to keep Ben in her life, to see him grow even if he was no longer truly her son. That night, in a bed that was new and comfortable, Marianne allowed herself to shed tears one last time. Not tears of loss, but of gratitude, for the fate that had brought Ben into her life, for the courage to do what was right, and for the generosity of a man who understood family goes beyond blood. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside the yellow house with the blue door, there was only the warmth of a new beginning, a new life, new memories to be made, and the certainty that tomorrow was no longer something to fear. 2 months had passed since the reunion. Life had settled into a new, different rhythm, but a good one. John visited the yellow house almost every day with Ben, and on weekends, Marianne and the girls went to the mansion, which was gradually being rebuilt. On that Thursday morning, the sky was exceptionally clear. Marianne worked in her studio, putting the final touches on a dress for Morgan Industries' new collection. Orders poured in, and she'd even hired 2 assistants to help. The twins had adapted surprisingly quickly to their new school. Nora excelled in math and science, while Sadie charmed teachers with her creativity in art class. At John's insistence, Marianne had accepted a part-time nanny to watch Ben some afternoons at the Yellow House. That arrangement let him maintain a routine with his sisters, as he called the twins, while also allowing John time to reorganize his company. It all seemed to be falling into place at last. The pain of near loss was giving way to a new family structure. Unusual, but it worked for them. The phone rang mid-afternoon, interrupting Marianne's thoughts. "Hello," she answered, pressing the receiver to her shoulder while adjusting some pins in the fabric. "Marianne, it's John." His voice was tense, different from usual. "I have to cancel today's visit. Something important came up." Marianne set the fabric aside, feeling a sudden worry. "Is Ben all right?" "Yes, he's fine. He's with Mrs. Peterson. It's another matter." He paused, as though weighing his words. "I've received some information about the fire. I'm reviewing it now." "I see." Marianne sensed not to pry. "The girls will miss him tonight, but they'll understand." "Thank you." His gratitude sounded genuine. "I promise to make it up this weekend." After hanging up, Marianne mulled it over. The fire was a topic rarely mentioned. For everyone, the main thing was that Ben was safe. The past, with its shadows, seemed better left behind. But now, something had brought those shadows back. In the mansion's large office, John sat behind his desk, staring at the thick envelope before him. The private investigator he'd hired weeks earlier had finally delivered his full report. Initially, John only wanted to understand how Ben had survived and ended up in that alley. But the preliminary findings hinted at something far more sinister. With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope and spread its contents across the desk. Reports, testimonies, technical analyses, and photos. Dozens of photos. The investigator's conclusion was clear. This was no accident. The fire had been set in at least 3 distinct areas of the East Wing, using some kind of accelerant, carefully planned to look like an electrical short. John felt his stomach turn. If it wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. Someone had tried to kill his son on purpose, but who and why? The next photos offered possible answers. The investigator had found a neighbor's security camera, partially covering the mansion's side entrance near the East Wing. The footage, captured less than 20 minutes before the fire started, clearly showed a figure rushing out with something in their arms. John picked up the enlarged image and held it under the lamp. The figure was partially in shadow, but was undeniably carrying a baby wrapped in blankets. His baby. Someone had taken Ben from his room before the fire began. Someone who knew the house, had access, and knew exactly where the nursery was. For the first time since finding his son, John felt the old pain morph into something stronger, sharper, outrage. All the grief he'd endured, the emptiness, the despair, now had a new dimension. This wasn't merely cruel fate, but a deliberate human act, someone he knew. Because in the following pages, the investigator had compared the figure's silhouette, posture, and movements to reference images. Certain characteristics were unmistakable. John stood abruptly, crossing to the far wall of the office where portraits of his family hung. His gaze landed on one in particular, him with his younger brother, Ryan, taken the day they opened the new factory 2 years ago. Ryan, who had always lived in John's shadow. Ryan, who had taken over the business temporarily after the fire when John was too devastated to function. Ryan, who insisted they sell John's shares, claiming it was a fresh start. John glared at the portrait, silently confronting the image of the brother smiling by his side. How had he not seen the signs? They were all there, the rush with paperwork, the veiled suggestions that maybe Ben really was gone, the push to assume more control of the company. The phone rang, piercing the tense silence of the office. John answered automatically. "Mr. Morgan?" It was the investigator's voice. "I found something else you need to see." "What is it?" "I'd rather show you in person. It concerns that abandoned building near the canal, where the woman found your son." John felt a chill crawl up his spine. "I'll be at your office in half an hour." He hung up and grabbed his coat, carefully packing the report in his briefcase. Before leaving, he gave one last glance at the portrait on the wall. His brother's face now seemed distorted, as though seen through shattered glass. In a swift motion, John turned the portrait to face the wall. He couldn't bear to look at it until he knew everything. The investigator's office was downtown, in an old red brick building. He was a middle-aged man named Cooper, a former police officer known for being thorough and discreet, qualities John valued more than ever. "Mr. Morgan, thank you for coming so quickly," Cooper said, greeting him at the door. "Please, Have a seat. The office was Spartan, a wooden desk, some filing cabinets, a phone. On the walls, only his diploma and license, no personal photos or decorations. What did you find? John asked, cutting to the chase. Cooper opened a drawer and produced a small envelope. After identifying that figure on the mansion's security footage, I decided to investigate the area where your son was found. That alley is less than a mile from a supposedly abandoned warehouse once owned by Morgan Industries. John nodded. He remembered that property, an old storage unit the company had sold off when it was no longer needed. Turns out, the warehouse isn't as abandoned as it looks, Cooper continued. It's been in use for the past few months. And guess by whom? Without waiting for an answer, he slid a photograph across the desk. John picked it up, his hands tense. It was a night vision shot, taken from a distance, but clear enough. Ryan entering the warehouse, glancing around furtively. Date stamp is 2 days before the fire, Cooper pointed out. John felt ice in his veins. There's more, the investigator went on, placing another photo in front of him. This was taken inside the warehouse yesterday. It was risky to go in, but worth it. The image showed a makeshift room in the back of the warehouse, a simple crib, a few children's toys, and a chair. A calendar hung on the wall, certain dates marked. He planned it all, John murmured, his voice raspy with shock. Took Ben from his room, started the fire, and intended to keep him hidden here. From what I can tell, yes, Cooper agreed, but something went wrong. Maybe the baby cried too much. Maybe he was spotted. Either way, he had to get rid of the kid quickly and left him in the alley, probably hoping no one would find him alive. John's mind raced, piecing together this horrifying puzzle. Why? He asked, more to himself than to Cooper. Why would Ryan do this? The investigator slid another document forward, a copy of John's will. As I suspected. With your wife gone, if anything happened to you, your son inherits everything. If both of you died, your brother is the next in line. Cooper paused meaningfully. And who'd be the legal guardian of Ben if something happened to you? John closed his eyes, though he already knew the answer. Ryan. Exactly. Your brother had much to gain if your son disappeared, and you, overwhelmed by grief, stepped away from running the business, which is precisely what happened. John felt a wave of nausea. His own brother had orchestrated this. He had planned the murder of an innocent baby, his own nephew, for money and power. What do you plan to do now, Mr. Morgan? Cooper asked, watching his reaction carefully. John inhaled deeply, trying to order his chaotic thoughts. I need solid proof, something the police can't ignore. I'm on it, Cooper promised. I have a contact in forensics who can reopen the fire investigation with these new findings. I'm also keeping tabs on your brother. If he returns to the warehouse, we'll have more evidence. John nodded, a cold resolve replacing his initial shock. Keep going. I want everything documented and legal. When we confront Ryan, I want no escape routes. He left Cooper's office in a daze, the day that had begun so peacefully now cloaked in the darkest shadows of the past, shadows with a familiar face. He drove back to the mansion in silence, gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. On the passenger seat, the folder containing the report seemed to smolder, as though it held not just paper, but embers from the fire that nearly destroyed his life. Back in his office, he found a message from his secretary. Ryan had called, wanting to discuss some factory contracts. He would be at the company's main office at 9 the next morning, expecting John there. John crushed the note in his hand. Yes, they would meet, but it wouldn't be about contracts. He walked to the large window overlooking the garden. In the distance, he could see the reconstruction of the east wing, workers diligently erecting new walls atop old ashes. For an instant, he thought of calling Marianne, telling her everything he'd discovered. But he decided against it. She and the girls had already been through enough. They deserved the peace they had finally found. This was a battle he had to face alone. The office door opened softly, and Mrs. Peterson entered with Ben in her arms. He was asking for Daddy, the housekeeper said kindly. Looks like someone missed you. John took his son, feeling the comforting warmth of the child's small body against him. Ben smiled, gripping his father's face with his little hands as he often did. Papa, he exclaimed happily. In that moment, gazing into his son's innocent eyes, John knew with absolute clarity what he had to do. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting Ben and ensuring no one ever endangered him again. Tomorrow, he would confront Ryan, not with explosive rage or dramatic accusations, but with the quiet strength of truth. The scattered fragments had formed a clear picture, and it could no longer be ignored. Holding Ben, who was dozing off in his arms, John cast one last look at the portrait turned to the wall. The brother he had known, or thought he knew, no longer existed. In his place was a stranger whose actions demanded consequences. Serious consequences. Morgan Industries headquarters occupied a grand building in the city center, 6 floors of glass and steel, with the family name in bold letters on the facade. John arrived promptly at 9, his outward composure masking the storm inside. The young receptionist recognized him and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. Your brother is already in the conference room." John gave a curt nod. Inside his leather briefcase were not the contracts Ryan expected, but Cooper's evidence, photos, reports, forensic analyses, pieces of truth that formed a devastating whole. On the way to the elevator, John caught his reflection in the polished doors. He was calm. Surprisingly so. The previous night had been long, filled with difficult decisions. He concluded he would not let hate consume him. Ben was alive and safe. That was all that truly mattered. As the elevator rose to the 5th floor, he prepared himself. Not for an angry confrontation laced with yelling, but for something harder. To face the betrayal of someone once considered family, without sacrificing his own dignity. Ryan stood by the window of the conference room, gazing at the city. He turned as the door opened, wearing a confident smile. "John, good to see you." He stepped forward, arms wide for a hug. John did not return. "I thought you weren't coming." "Why wouldn't I?" John asked, voice level. "Well, you've been so busy with the boy lately," Ryan shrugged, returning to his spot by the table. "You hardly appear at the office." John set his briefcase on the table, but didn't open it. "Ben is fine, thanks for asking." An awkward silence fell. Ryan seemed to sense something was off, but kept a polite smile, although it didn't reach his eyes. "Shall we talk contracts, then? The Chinese proposal is promising, but I think we can negotiate better terms if—" "I'm not here to talk contracts, Ryan," John interrupted, his tone unchanged. Ryan frowned, a flash of anxiety crossing his features. "No, then what?" John opened his briefcase and slid the first photo across the table, the security camera image showing a shadowy figure leaving the mansion, cradling a baby. "Recognize it?" John asked, voice devoid of accusation. "Just a question." Ryan's face visibly paled. His eyes flicked to the photo, then darted away as if looking might incriminate him. "What the hell is this? I can't see anything in that blurry image." John slid over the next photo, Ryan entering the abandoned warehouse 2 days before the fire. "How about this one? Is it clearer now?" Ryan jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair. "Where did you get that? Have you been spying on me?" "No," John said calmly. "I've been investigating the fire that almost killed my son. The fire you set." Ryan let out a forced, harsh laugh. "That's insane. Why would I do such a thing?" In reply, John placed his will on the table, relevant clauses highlighted. "Because if I was broken by grief and Ben was dead, you would inherit everything, the business, the estate, the fortune." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture John knew from childhood. He always did that when cornered. "You're out of your mind. You're still traumatized." John remained composed, continuing to present evidence. The forensic report showing the fire was arson, the expert analysis matching the figure's physical traits to Ryan, the photos of the makeshift room in the warehouse where he had planned to keep Ben. With each piece, Ryan's posture crumbled, from outraged to defensive, from defensive to trapped. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. "Why not just kill him outright?" John asked, unable to hide a tremor in his voice. "Why keep him alive?" Ryan slumped into a chair, his facade finally shattering completely. "I never wanted to hurt the kid," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "I just wanted you to think he was dead, so you'd step back from the business." And afterward, when I recovered or kept searching, Ryan shrugged pathetically. I'd have enough time to take control. I'd figure out some explanation. John closed his eyes, absorbing the calculated cruelty of that plan. When he opened them, his gaze held no anger, only deep, irrevocable disappointment. What went wrong? He wouldn't stop crying, Ryan confessed, staring at his hands. Someone could have heard. I needed to hush him, but I couldn't. So I left him in the alley, thinking no one would find him in time. John's chest constricted at the thought of his small, defenseless son abandoned in that dark alley. He pictured Marianne and her daughters, the miracle of their arrival at just the right moment. Did you know he survived? John asked, though he already guessed the answer. Ryan nodded slowly. When you announced you'd found him, it was a nightmare. I tried convincing myself it was another baby, but then saw the pictures in the papers. And still you said nothing. You stuck to your plan. What else could I do? Confess, Ryan spat bitterly. I was already in too deep. John rose to his feet, gathering the documents back into his briefcase. You know what hurts the most? I would have shared everything with you. If you needed money, power, recognition, you only had to ask. You'd never understand, Ryan murmured, bitterness glinting in his eyes. You were always the golden boy, the perfect son, the rightful heir. I was just a shadow. John shook his head, refusing to be drawn into self-pity. These were your choices, Ryan. At that moment, the conference room door opened. Cooper entered, accompanied by two plainclothes police officers. Ryan went pale at the sight of them. What is this? Ryan demanded, though it was obvious. Justice, John replied simply. I gave all the evidence to the authorities last night. They have a warrant for your arrest. As the officers stepped toward Ryan, reciting his rights, John stood still, his face an unmoving mask hiding his pain at this betrayal. Ryan resisted at first, with anger, then pleading, John, please, we're brothers, family, you can't do this to me. You left my son to die, John said quietly, but with resolve. You orchestrated my downfall. Family is much more than blood, Ryan. It's loyalty, love, protection, not destruction. As the officers began leading Ryan away, John stepped forward, not to intervene, but to say one final thing. You tried to snuff out a life, he said softly. But they brought it back, along with everything I am. Ryan made no reply, a tumult of anger and shame in his eyes as he was taken from the room. Cooper stayed behind, regarding John with respect. Are you sure you want to keep the press out of this? He asked. It might be easier at trial if public opinion is on your side. John shook his head. I don't want a circus or a scandal. I want justice, not revenge. He paused, thinking of Ben, Marianne, and the girls. There's been enough destruction. Now it's time to rebuild. Cooper nodded in understanding. As you wish. I'll do my best to keep it discreet. The judge has already agreed to seal the case, given a minor is involved. Thank you, Cooper. For everything. Left alone in the conference room, John walked to the window down below. He could see the police car driving off, taking away his brother, or the stranger his brother had become. There was no triumph in that moment, no relief, only the certainty of having done the right thing, and maybe a small glimmer of peace. He thought about how he'd explain it all to Marianne. She deserved to know the truth, as did the girls, though he'd have to choose his words carefully. He decided he'd talk to Marianne first, that night, once the children were asleep. His phone buzzed. It was her, almost as if his thoughts had summoned her. Hello, John. Is everything all right? The girls are excited for Ben's visit later. The sound of her voice pulled him back to what truly mattered, the present, the future they were building. Everything's fine, he said, for the first time meaning it. Tell them we'll be there for dinner. I have some updates to share. Good news, I hope. He hesitated, considering. Necessary news, he finally said. But yes, in the end, it's good for all of us. He hung up and looked out over the city before leaving the room. The sky was clear, no clouds, a new day, with painful truths, but also a chance for healing. Justice had been served, not with shouting or bloodshed sake, but with the quiet power of truth. The days following Ryan's arrest passed with a curious silence. As John wished, the case stayed out of the headlines. To the outside world, Ryan Morgan had simply stepped away from the family business for personal reasons. Telling Marianne was difficult, but necessary. One Thursday night, after the girls and Ben were asleep, John explained everything. They sat on the small porch of the yellow house, his words falling like heavy stones between them. Marianne listened silently, her eyes wide with initial disbelief, then brimming with tears as she grasped the depth of the betrayal. When John finished, she simply held his hand for a long time without speaking. There were no adequate words. "The girls don't need the details," Marianne said finally. "They're too young to understand something so dark." John agreed. For Sadie and Nora, it would suffice to say Uncle Ryan had gone away and wouldn't be back for a long time. 2 weeks had passed since that evening. Life found a lighter rhythm, as if the last remaining shadow had finally been banished. The mansion's reconstruction was nearly complete. The company thrived under John's renewed leadership, now more balanced with his family life. And the Yellow House. The Yellow House had become much more than just a home for Marianne and her daughters. It had become a second home for Ben, and in some ways, even for John. That Sunday morning, spring had finally arrived in earnest. The front garden was awash with the flowers Nora and Sadie had planted, guided by a book John had given them. The tree with the swing sported new leaves of pale green. John parked in front of the house, feeling that familiar surge of contentment he always felt coming here. Ben, buckled in his car seat, was already waving his arms in excitement. "Mama's house," he exclaimed, his pronunciation much clearer than just weeks ago. "Yes, son, Marianne's house." The moment John opened the car door, the front door of the house burst open, and 2 small whirlwinds came hurtling toward him. "Uncle John!" "Ben!" Sadie yelled, always the first to reach him, wrapping her arms around his legs. "You're late," Nora joined in, more measured but equally delighted. She immediately began unfastening Ben from his seat. "You promised 10, and it's almost 11. John chuckled, lifting Sadie while Nora lifted Ben. Traffic's fault. And a certain someone didn't want to take a bath this morning. They entered the house together, a noisy parade of laughter and chatter. Marianne stood in the living room, smiling at the scene. "I thought we agreed on 10, Mr. Morgan," she teased. "Forgive my unforgivable tardiness, Ms. Wilson," John joked back with an exaggerated bow, earning giggles from the girls. "By way of penance, I bring gifts." He darted back to the car, returning with a medium-sized box. The twins hovered around him curiously. "It's the books we promised," John announced, opening the box. Inside was a small collection of children's books, bright with illustrations and simple text for early readers. Also 2 pretty notebooks with sturdy covers and a set of colored pencils. The girls' eyes lit up. Sadie picked up one of the books, flipping through the pages with reverent care. Nora ran her hand over the notebook, appreciating its cover. "It's so pretty," she murmured. "They're for practicing your writing," John explained, settling on the sofa while Ben explored the living room, clearly at ease. "Your mom told me you're both doing very well at school." "I already know the whole alphabet," Sadie announced proudly. "Want to see?" Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed one of the new pencils and a notebook, plopped down on the rug, and stuck her tongue out in concentration as she carefully formed letters. Nora approached John, her gaze serious and contemplative beyond her 6 years. "Thanks for the books," she said simply. "I'm learning to read really fast. The teacher says I'm the best in class." "I'm not surprised," John replied, genuinely impressed by her maturity. Marianne stood in the kitchen doorway, watching with a soft expression. It was surreal. If someone had told her 3 months ago that she'd be living in this house, seeing her daughters interact so naturally with one of the most influential men in the city. Sadie finished her demonstration and brought the notebook for John to see. "Look, I wrote your name, mine, Nora's, Mom's, and Ben's." John examined her work with the appropriate seriousness. The letters were irregular and sometimes mirrored, but perfectly readable. A warmth spread through his chest. "That's wonderful, Sadie," he praised. "You're becoming a great writer." The girl beamed, racing off to show her mother. Nora remained by John's side, watching Ben build with colorful blocks on the rug. "He really likes coming here," Nora remarked. "So of course he does. You're his family too." Nora nodded, as though it were obvious. At school, I told them I have a baby brother, but he doesn't live with us. The teacher thought it was strange, so I explained that a family doesn't have to live all together to be a family. What matters is caring about each other. John felt a lump in his throat. So of all the things his wealth could buy, the simple wisdom of this child was not one of them. It was a precious gift. Your teacher is lucky to have such a bright student, he managed, voice thick with emotion. The morning flew by. Sadie and Nora took turns showing John their newest achievements at school, and he was an attentive audience, reacting with genuine enthusiasm to each small success. Marianne prepared lunch, a simple stew, but delicious, along with fresh bread she had bought at the nearby bakery. The meal was lively, full of stories and laughter, so different from the formal, hushed dinners John recalled from his own upbringing at the mansion. After lunch, while Ben dozed in Marianne's arms, Sadie and Nora led John outside to see the backyard garden, where they'd planted a small vegetable patch. "Look, Uncle John," Sadie pointed proudly to the tiny green shoots peeking from the earth. "They're carrots. I planted them. And those are tomatoes," Nora added, pointing to another section. "Before long, we'll be able to eat them." John studied the fragile sprouts, full of promise, like these children, like Ben, like this new life they were all creating after the storm. "You're doing a fantastic job," he praised, crouching to see more closely. "I'm really impressed." "Mom helps us," Nora said. "She knows all about plants." "She learned from my grandma when she was a kid," Sadie added. "Grandma had a huge garden, right, Nora?" "Yes, but we never met her. Mom just tells us stories." Again, John realized how little he knew about Marianne's life before they found Ben. He asked questions sometimes, but she was private about her past. He respected that, though curiosity lingered. When they returned inside, Ben was awake, playing contentedly with Marianne in the living room. The rest of the afternoon was filled with games, reading the new books, and discussing weekend plans. As the sun began to set, bathing the kitchen in golden light, John found himself reflecting on how this simple place had become so special to him. It lacked the splendor or history of the Morgan mansion, but it possessed something far more valuable: life, warmth, love. "Will you stay for dinner?" Marianne asked, putting away some books the children had scattered. "If it's not too much trouble." She smiled, and her eyes lit up. "It's never trouble to have you here, John." Dinner was modest: vegetable soup, leftover bread, and a small apple pie Marianne had prepared as a surprise. For John, it was one of the finest meals he'd ever had. The twins shared school stories. Ben tried saying new words, and an unmistakable sense of belonging filled the air, a feeling he hadn't known since Emma had passed. When the meal ended, Ben was getting sleepy, rubbing his eyes while fighting to stay awake. Sitting on Marianne's lap, he rested his head against her chest, losing his battle against drowsiness. John watched them, a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost hurt. This moment, this picture of his son safe and loved, was a miracle he had almost lost, if not for Marianne and her girls. He raised his glass, still holding a bit of apple juice. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Ben. Instantly, Sadie and Nora lifted their glasses, adopting solemn expressions as if this were a grand ceremony. Marianne raised hers as well, smiling slightly. "2 second chances," John said, gazing directly at Marianne, "and new beginnings." "2 second chances and new beginnings," the girls chorused, before sipping their juice enthusiastically. Marianne merely nodded, her eyes locking with John's over Ben's sleeping head. No words were necessary to understand what that toast meant to them both. As John got up to help clear the table, he noticed a framed photo on a small shelf in the living room. It was recent. Sadie, Nora, and Ben sitting on the backyard swing, all three laughing for the camera. His heart constricted at the sight. "We took it last week," Nora explained, seeing his interest. "Mum said we needed some new pictures." "It's wonderful," John said, carefully picking up the frame. "Could I have a copy?" "Of course," Marianne answered, joining them with Ben still asleep in her arms. "I have the negatives." Sadie approached, a shadow crossing her usually cheerful face. "Uncle John, we'll still get to see Ben, right?" she asked, voice small and uncertain. Even now that the bad man is gone, Nora added, surprising them with her insight. Apparently, she understood more about Ryan's situation than the adults realized. John set the photo down and knelt to their level. "Of course you will," he promised sincerely. "Anytime you want, my home is always open to you, just as this one is open to me." Their identical faces lit up with relief. "And if you like," John continued, "we could even spend some time at a beach house I own once summer arrives. Kids love the beach." "A beach house?" Sadie's eyes went wide. "You have a beach house?" John laughed at her amazement. "I do, but I hardly ever visit. It would be wonderful to fill it with children's laughter again." Marianne shook her head, a reluctant smile forming. "You're going to spoil them, John." "No more than they deserve," he said, standing up, his gaze meeting hers above the children's heads. "You gave me back the greatest treasure of my life. Nothing I do will ever be enough to repay that." Silence fell, charged with emotion, broken only by Ben's soft breathing. "We didn't do it for thanks," Marianne finally said in a near whisper. "We did it out of love." Just like that. 4 words that said it all. Love. Not the fairy tale romance kind, but something equally powerful. The love that builds families, forges bonds, heals wounds, and lights the path forward. When John finally said goodbye, carrying a drowsy Ben wrapped in a blanket, he felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. The shadows had receded. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched ahead with possibilities. In the front yard, under a starry sky, Marianne walked him to the car. The girls had already run off to get ready for bed. "Thank you for today," John said, carefully settling Ben into his car seat. "It was perfect." "It's always a pleasure to have you both," she replied, helping adjust the baby's blanket. For a moment, they simply stood there in the quiet night, side by side, watching the little miracle sleeping in the back seat, the child they both loved, the bond they shared. "Good night, John." "Good night, Marianne." Driving home, John glanced in the rearview mirror at Ben, sleeping soundly. He thought of the twins, of their proud smiles and excited chatter. He thought of Marianne, her strength, her generosity. He had lost so much and gained so much. They were all happy. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.